I think those who made this law have no idea what it is like to live on the street.
The Hungarian government and its right-wing Prime Minister Viktor Orban is known for railing against the EU and asylum seekers. Now they have a new target, the homeless. A new law has come into effect that outlaws sleeping on the streets. The government argues the ban will actually save lives by forcing people off the streets and into state institutions. But critics say fining rough sleepers is cruel and impractical. And according to some experts, there are only half the number of places needed in state-run shelters to house all of Hungary's homeless. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Budapest by Tessza Udvarhelyi. She's an activist with the group The City is for All, which works for housing rights and aims to empower the homeless. And in San Antonio, Texas, is Robert Marbut. He's worked on addressing homelessness for more than 3 decades and is a principal consultant at Marbut Consulting. I thank you both for joining us. Tessza, the government has a rationale behind this. They say they're going to save lives. They say they're going to eliminate homelessness and panhandling, and they're going to make the streets safer. Do you accept that at all? Even if you disagree, do you accept that they have good intentions?
It's really difficult to imagine that they have good intentions. If you want to put an end to homelessness, you actually have to provide housing for people, and not only homeless people, but everyone who lacks affordable, safe and healthy housing. And today the Hungarian government is not doing that. The only thing that the Hungarian government is doing is criminalize homelessness. Otherwise, there are no measures at all to support housing for the poor.
So, Robert, is that what it is? Criminalizing homelessness, no more, no less?
I think it is, and like your other guests suggested, it doesn't work. At a fundamental level, it becomes a gimmick that makes the politicians feel good for 8, 9, 10 hours. But in the end, you overcrowd your jails, you overcrowd your criminal justice system, and the individuals end up going back on the street, and you've done nothing to address the root causes of homelessness or rough sleeping.
So, Tessza, if they actually had the spaces available in shelters and government-run institutions and they treated people properly there and it was decent, would you be more sympathetic to their drive to getting people off the streets?
No, because we think that homeless shelters are not the solution to homelessness. Homeless shelters are basically just emergency solutions. And right now, what they do is warehouse people. So they are just keeping people off the streets without offering any kind of alternative or exit out of the system. So what we are saying is that the government should introduce measures that prevent homelessness, for example, by preventing families from becoming homeless, from preventing children being taken away from their families because they become homeless. And the government needs to provide housing support for people who live in rental housing or even in private homes. Right now, all the government in Hungary is doing is supporting the housing of rich people, basically, or at least the middle class, but they are not doing anything to prevent people from becoming homeless or to help homeless people leave the homeless shelter system. They are basically just circulating in the system, going from one shelter to the other or going from the street to another shelter, but they are not really leaving. They don't have a chance to leave the system.
And Tessza, the fact that they actually changed the constitution in order to do this, and looking at some of the language that they've used for the homeless, does that worry you?
To be honest, it has worried us for 8 years now. So when this government came into power in 2010, one of their first measures was to introduce a very similar law to today's law, which then developed into a more, I would say, complex set of laws, which then the Constitutional Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to criminalize homelessness. And actually, the criminalization of homelessness got into the Hungarian constitution in 2012, exactly because the government didn't want, so they put it into the constitution so that it can't be ruled unconstitutional. So actually this kind of law has been in effect for many years, and this is just the latest variation, and I would say the most cruel variation of the same law.
And do you believe, Tessza, that it's a continuation of, as some people see it, the rhetoric against immigrants, the rhetoric against outsiders, the homeless folded into this?
Yes, I agree. I think it's part of this enemy-making process that the government is using to keep its power. So over the past 8 years, they have created enemies out of homeless people, refugees, migrants, Roma people, poor people, even people with disabilities, they always need someone to fight against. And I think they have kind of run out of enemies, so now they are returning back to an old enemy of theirs, which is homeless people, because this cycle of criminalization already took place in 2011 to 2012. And then came the refugees, and then also NGOs became a big enemy of the government. So I think they are using homeless people as a tool of political manipulation to create political power and to create an anti-homeless and anti-other atmosphere.
Right. So, Robert, if a member of the Hungarian government was watching this and they thought, well, okay, maybe we've got this wrong, and they called you up and said, you've got decades of experience here, we're going to fly you into Budapest, tell us what to do. We've got 30,000 people out on the streets. How can we do this better? What would you say they need to do?
Well, first is you got to realize criminalization won't work, and that's a gimmick, and that will just give you a short-term boost, maybe 8, 9, 10 hours, and it won't work in the long run. What we know that works is working on the root causes of homelessness, working on mental health, substance abuse, and post-traumatic stress. That's really where you need to focus, and if you focus in that area, the housing starts to fix itself because you have now the finances available to start doing market rate housing. But if you don't work on the root causes, you're never going to get a reduction in homelessness.
Okay, so you work on the root causes, but in the immediate present, there are these people on the streets. Where do they go?
Well, that's why the criminalization doesn't work. You can criminalize all you want, and nobody will have any place to go. So it will not work what the movement they're moving toward. It only works if you have enough both real housing and interim short-term shelter. And you don't want to do shelter in the long run, but short-term sheltering is a good entry into long-term housing. But you have to have enough of that for it. So if there are 20 to 30,000 individuals on the street, if you only have 11,000 beds, that's not going to work. You're set up for failure already.
Yeah. So Tessza, I'm looking at some of the instruments in the government toolbox here when it comes to the homeless, and if you refuse to leave the streets. So as far as I understand, the authorities can impose fines. They can give prison sentences as well, or mandatory participation in public works programs. This has just come into effect. From what you understand, Tessza, has it been happening? Have people been fined or been sent to prison so far?
Yeah, actually, in this new version of the law, there is no fines. So you can either get a warning from the court, you can be forced into public work, or you can go to prison. So these are the three options that any court has if somebody is charged with habitual residence in public space or homelessness. And yes, the police started enforcing this law on the day that it came into effect, on October 15th, so on Monday. And there have already been 4 cases that we know of. 4 homeless people have already been brought in front of the court. And so far, 3 of them have received only warnings. And right. In the case of the 4th person, his physical health was not good enough for the court, so they postponed the actual procedure.
And Tessza, the United Nations and the European Union have both been critical of the law, especially as it hit the point of implementation. Does Viktor Orban care, or do you think that they might actually recalibrate and do something if there's external pressure?
That's very difficult to tell with our government. On the outside, they always resist external pressure, and then we never know what's happening in the background. In the case of the European Union, it has happened often that their public rhetoric was really aggressive and strong against the European Union, but in the background, they actually did a lot of small adjustments to the expectations of the European Union. I think in the case of homeless people, it's simply just not. I think outside pressure is not the key. I think Hungarians need to step up against this, and it's actually happening. So people are showing much more solidarity than before, and I think it has, in this sense, a good impact on Hungarian society, because it's actually something that we discuss now, and a lot of people are showing solidarity, and they want to help homeless people, and they want to oppose legislation like this.
Okay, and Robert, very finally for you, I want to sort of cast a global net here. I've lived in many cities, in many countries around the world. Each of those cities has a very different approach to homelessness, from cities such as San Francisco on the one hand to, say, Johannesburg, South Africa on the other. Given your knowledge, is there anywhere that they're doing it right, or they have done it right, where they had a major problem of homelessness and they found a way to make it go away without harming the homeless?
And the answer is yes. The area called Pinellas County, which is the western jurisdiction of Tampa, has done a very great job. Here in San Antonio, we've done a very good job. And the key is if you focus on recovery and rehabilitation, rather than either the symptoms on one extreme or the other extreme, criminalization, if you work in the middle, you can really make it work.
Okay, Robert Marbut and Tessza Udvarhelyi, it's been good to talk Hungary and homelessness with you. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.